Okay, well, good morning once again. Today's the fourth week of our series on apologetics, and we are going through the 12 points that show Christianity to be true. And I wanted to, Rook Mother, take the whole package. Jeanette, can you help her take a whole pack for today? We're on point 3, which says a theistic God exists. And we looked at two arguments for the existence of God. One was the cosmological argument. We looked at the explanation for the beginning of the universe. And then last week we looked at the argument from design, or the teleological argument. And there's still another one I'm going to look at next week, the moral argument, but kind of sandwiched in between those two. I want to look at Darwin's theory of evolution today. Since we had quite a discussion on some scientific issues last week, I really wanted to address this particular issue. I think it's important because the way that Darwin's theory of evolution works, I believe, conflicts with the biblical account of creation. And so part of our job, I guess, of defending the faith would be to address this issue. And if Darwin is correct, then that means the creation story in the Bible is incorrect. And so for that reason, I think it's important to address the issue. And what we find is that there are so many problems with the theory of evolution that there's no need for us to worry about this conflict, I don't think. Of course, depending, if you go and talk to a scientist who is, in the scientific community today is by and large atheistic or agnostic at best, then they will cling on to this theory and tell you that it's true and tell you that it's established. And so many shows on TV refer to the theory of evolution as though it's been already established as a fact, and we just assume it's true.
Bill Nye, the science.
Well, yeah, he's a very good example of someone who just assumes the truth of it and scoffs at those who would question the great demigod Darwin. But we are going to see today that thankfully there are a number, and in fact a growing number of scientists in the scientific community who are questioning the theory of evolution on scientific grounds, not on religious grounds, but on scientific grounds, and that's what we want to look at today. It's easy to question our unbelieving friends using the Bible. But again, that's not going to convince them. They'll just say, well, that's your holy book, that's your religious book. Don't convince me with that. So our approach here in this series is to approach our unbelieving friends on their ground, on the ground that they stand on, and that would be science. And so what I've done here is looked at the work of, like I said, a growing number of scientists in the scientific community who are fairly looking at the issue and saying that the evidence just doesn't lead to the conclusion that Darwin thought that it did. So, with that in mind, let's just begin to look at it. What I want to do, just to begin with, is to look at two terms. It's very, very important that we understand the distinction between these two terms: microevolution and macroevolution. Okay. First, microevolution. The way we would talk about that term. It refers to variations that occur within a particular species, and this presents no conflict with biblical perspectives. This would be slight changes, and I'm going to give you an example of that. We do see species experience changes over time, but those are changes within a species. Macroevolution, on the other hand, refers to large-scale changes where one species transforms into a completely different species. And this is what I believe conflicts with the Genesis account. And this is how Darwin would explain all the different species that are in the world today, is that they have come from the same origin, but gradually developed into separate species. So how does that work? Let's just look at that right now. How does evolution work? And probably most of you are familiar with these things if you've come up through the school system. Random mutations cause changes or variations in a population of organism. Usually those are genetic mutations, but something changes in a particular organism. And those modified organisms then compete to survive and to reproduce. and those which are best able to survive and reproduce do so, and they tend to leave the most offspring. And this is called natural selection. So when something happens to a species and it changes in some way, if that helps that species survive, then that trait is passed along to the next generation. And that's how these modifications go from generation to generation. Over time, through mutation or adaptation or natural selection, continued small changes result in a gradual transition of creatures into a completely new species. And as I said, evolution claims that all organisms are related through common ancestry. So before we go on, let's just take a look at an example that is often used to say, well, here's a present-day example of evolution. And when Darwin was on the Galapagos Islands, there was a species of bird, finches, are on the island. And these finches he noticed, and they were studied again, I think, in the 1990s, actually. And what happened was these birds are on the island, and they need water, fresh water, to drink. And what happened was there's a drought. And so it turns out that the birds that had slightly longer beaks were able to get down into the crevices of the land and get the little water that was there. And so they were able to survive. The finches that had a slightly shorter beaks died because they couldn't get to the water. And so over several generations, they noticed that the species of birds now had longer and longer beaks. And they said, well, there's evolution. You know, you go from a bird with a tiny beak, and now all the birds have large beaks. That's how evolution works. Now, I would say that there's no question in observing those facts. Those facts are absolutely true, but what do those facts tell us? First of all, it tells us that it's a good example of microevolution, because the birds were still birds. Okay, they didn't turn into cats or, you know, other types of animals. They were still birds. But what a lot of times the evolutionists do not mention is that when the rain came back and there was plenty of water supply, what they found was the size of the bird beaks began to revert back to a normal size, because now the few birds that are born with shorter beaks can get water, and now they can survive. And so within several generations, it actually reversed itself, and you were back to the original size beaks. And so this really is a great example of what we would call microevolution, changes that occur within a species. And that's fine, we observe that. But at the end of the day, or after the whole series is over, the birds are still birds. They didn't change in terms of species. So anyway, what I want to do, having made that distinction, there are four separate problems that I see with evolution that I think are insurmountable and lead us to really question the truth of the theory. And so the first problem comes in the form of a question. Exactly how does this gradual transition to a different species actually occur? And so what the scientists say is that this most often happens, and through history, happen through genetic mutations in the DNA of the animals. And it's observed every once in a while that there's something and the DNA is just, the DNA in our cells is a long, very long code of information, coded information, kind of like a computer code, if you will, but more complex than a computer code, as it turns out. But it's a long string of information, and in that extremely long series of information are all the instructions for that living cell. In every cell you have DNA, and those are the instructions for that cell to operate, to function, and to reproduce. And so the cell cannot live without this crucial DNA. But every once in a while, when a new cell is formed, there's a slight mutation in the series of information in the DNA. And so what Darwinists claim is that that mutation results in a certain change in the species. And again, if that change is beneficial, it's going to help that individual survive, and that trait will be passed on then in the next generation. And that's how evolution works. But today, as scientists have continued to understand genetics, as they have continued to understand how DNA works, they have come to the conclusion that all known genetic mutations are not beneficial. They are harmful to the individual, or they are at best neutral. You can't find a genetic mutation where it actually helps the animal. One of the great examples that evolutionists use as well is the four-winged fruit fly. Now, fruit flies have two wings normally, as all flies do. But scientists in the laboratory were able to manipulate the DNA in a fruit fly, and they were able to get fruit flies to be born that had a second set of wings. They're much tinier. I show this on a video when I teach it. But so they said by manipulating causing a mutation in the genes, that here they get this fruit fly that has an extra set of wings. And they said, well, this is a great example of what nature could have done on its own. You have an example here of evolution. But as I said, these mutations are supposed to help the creature survive. And it turned out, as impressive as that might look at first, that these extra wings that the scientists were able to cause to grow through the genes, the wings were not attached to any muscles. The genes didn't give the creature instruction on the muscles, so the wings didn't work. They were just there. So in order for the wings to be useful, you'd have to have other mutations occurring at the same time to cause the muscles to make the wings work. So as a result, these wings simply didn't work. And when they put the flies out into nature, they could not survive. The wings were cumbersome, and none of them survived, and they only could survive in the laboratory where they were given food. So it turns out that that really is not a very good example of evolution, because even though it was a controlled mutation, it did not actually help the animal, even though on the surface you would think, well, an extra set of wings would be great for the animal, but it simply did not work. Michael Denton is a scientist. He's a molecular biologist, and according to him, in his book Evolution: A Theory in Crisis, he talks about random mutations giving rise to evolution as, quote, an entirely unsubstantiated belief for which there is not the slightest evidence whatsoever. So we have to remember that this idea of mutations causing a beneficial result is just a theory. It's really not been observed. And so in his view, there's really no evidence for the theory. A great sounding theory, but there's no actual evidence for it. And evolutionists are just hard-pressed to defend this theory when it comes. The problem is they don't have to defend it very often, because almost the entire scientific community is in favor of this theory, and it's not challenged. And they really come down hard on people who challenge it. And there have been many cases at the university level, even the high school level, that for professors and teachers who try and challenge this theory are often reprimanded. Sometimes they even lose their job, and just because they're not in favor of evolution. Yeah.
One was mentioned by World Magazine, whose name was removed from a Wikipedia entry, because as soon as he stopped believing in evolution, he was removed.
Yeah, I mean, that's what you're up against. You can't. This is sacred turf for the scientific community, this theory of evolution, because I think it's all they've got. If it turns out that you are to jettison the theory of evolution as a scientist, then you have to come up with some other explanation as to where all these creatures have come from. And man, the last thing you want to do is let the Bible inform your beliefs, if you're an atheist. So they cling onto this theory very, very tightly.
Yeah. And what's interesting is that when it talks about, the idea that mutations were beneficial, that's where that whole idea of X-Men came from. This idea of mutants.
There you go.
The idea that, you'd have great DNA, you'd have all these superpowers.
Yeah.
Well, they're still humans. So.
Yeah. The analogy would be a computer code. I don't know if there's any computer programmers in here, but when you program a computer, there's these long series of computer code, and when there's a mistake in it, the mistake typically does not make the code better. It's called a bug, and it ruins things. It causes problems. It wreaks havoc, and that's the effect of these mutations. anytime you change a series of information randomly, you usually don't get something that helps or something that makes more sense. So
that's true with like do you know about epigenetics? It's like
go ahead and explain.
It's the new science where they found out that DNA is getting altered by certain genes being expressed or not expressed, and that can change based on lifestyle changes that the person makes throughout their lives. But it's also usually basically to the detriment of the DNA. It's not. It's never like to enhance it.
Exactly.
In the offspring. So.
Yeah, that's what's observed. And so what you find is that the evidence and the observation is conflicting with what the theory says should be happening. And that, for true scientists, that should be a red flag. That should say, wait a minute, because I think real science, true science, should follow the evidence wherever it leads. You don't want to use a theory to try and interpret the evidence. You take the evidence to change or to create your theory. So that's the problem is on genetic mutations. It really does not appear to be something that could help the theory. I think a bigger problem is problem number 2 is the fossil evidence. Since no humans were there to witness it, the only actual evidence of what occurred in the distant past is the fossil record. And this is very, very interesting because fossils are in many ways photographs of the ancient past. They're photographs of these creatures and their skeletons, right? So this is actual evidence. You can't argue when you find a fossil, right? It's there. We can theorize about other things that we haven't visually seen, but these are visual depictions of past reality. And so fossils are very, very important when it comes time to understanding what has actually happened in the past. So let's remember that the theory of evolution states that one species gradually transitions into a completely new species by a process of many small intermediate steps. Okay? And those steps are referred to as transitional forms. A fish doesn't, in the next generation, suddenly become a lizard, and able to walk. It would take many, many small steps for that to happen. The lizard doesn't become a bird, according to the theory of evolution, in one generation. It takes many generations of small, gradual changes, and the species gradually develops into something completely new. That's what the theory calls for. And again, Michael Denton, from the same book, a quote from him, he says this. There should be a quote to begin in front of the word surely, but he says, "Surely such transitions must have involved long lineages, including many lines of hundreds or probably thousands of transitional species." So in other words, what he's saying is that for one species to get to another species, there's hundreds or thousands of small steps in between to get you to the new species. So when we look at the fossil record, that's what we would expect to find. We would expect to find a preponderance of these in-between forms, these transitional forms. In fact, we would find more of those than maybe the actual species themselves, because there would be so many in between forms, right? In between steps. And yet, when you look at the fossil record, there are no undisputed transitional forms found in the fossil record. All are fully formed species. And this is a huge problem for the theory of evolution, because they have found just billions and billions of fossils, just old throughout the ages of Earth's history. And they can't find one that everybody says, oh yeah, this is kind of an in-betweener. And Charles Darwin said this. He said, because even in Darwin's day, this was known. Now, we found a lot of fossils since then, and nothing has changed, but even Darwin was aware of it. And in his book, Origin of the Species, here's what he writes. He says, "Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain. And this, perhaps, is the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against the theory." So Darwin's, he was aware of the fossil record, concerned about it, but in his day, he was convinced that as time went on and more fossils were found, that they would find these transitional forms. That was his belief. Now, as it's turned out, that hasn't been true. And one of the, let me just give you Mark Pagel. Mark Pagel is not a Christian. He's an evolutionary biologist, and he writes in the journal Nature in 1999, he says this: after 150 years of looking for missing links, and that would be the in-between transitional form, he says, scientists saw in the fossil records rapid bursts of change, new species appearing seemingly out of nowhere, and then remaining unchanged for millions of years. Patterns hauntingly reminiscent of creation. And this is an evolutionist who's kind of admitting that this is the situation. Do you have a question?
I have an announcement. George said that there's a car with its lights that have been on
It's
for
a
a while.
Ford, silver Ford.
Silver Ford. It's parked right up front here,
That
facing the
has to be
building. Anybody?
Okay, if anybody's got it.
Oh, that's you.
Oh, well,
Oh,
you
Laura.
want me to go in and
Laura,
turn
can
on
you
the
help?
lights for you?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, I'll do it.
Oh, you made Gloria's day a lot better with that announcement, I do believe. Well, the fossil record is our understanding of the fossil record is affected greatly by what's called the Cambrian explosion, and this is a. When we say explosion, I'm not talking about a literal bang like a bomb or anything, but an explosion of suddenly appearing fossils in the fossil record. It's a stunning variety of complex new forms that appear suddenly in the fossil record, fully formed. Scientists date this from between 500 to 600 million years ago. All right, that's their dating. And so this is quite old. But when they look at the record, they say prior to this, excuse me, fossil records reveal only primitive life forms such as algae, worms, and sponges. So these are very small, extremely primitive, simple life forms. And then in the fossil record, what you see, in a very, geologically speaking, very short period of time, a sudden burst where all of these different species, and I think there's, I'm not a scientist, I think there's 26 separate species or life forms that can be categorized by scientists. And I think almost all 26 appear suddenly, fully formed in the fossil record. And I have an example for you here called the trilobite. The trilobite is very tiny, but it's a very complex creature. It has body parts, it has a nervous system, compound eyes, and it appears fully formed at the beginning of the Cambrian explosion, or at the earliest point of the Cambrian explosion. And then its form remains the same over eons. They don't see any change. It doesn't evolve into anything else. It just stays the same consistently in the fossil record over time. And on the left, I have a picture of the fossil itself. It's very, very detailed. It's hard to see on the little replication. But then what they did was, based on that fossil, they constructed what it must have looked like, and that's the photo on the right. This is a really amazing example of something that just doesn't, in the fossil record, doesn't form by gradual changes leading up to it. It's just bang. There it is, fully formed, complex, nervous system, eyes, all the whole thing. It just is there. So this is a serious problem for evolutionists. And evolutionists, one of the more famous evolutionists was a guy by the name of Stephen Jay Gould. He is no longer alive, but he was one of the leading evolutionary scientists in the world back in like the 1970s and 80s. And he realized that this was a big problem, and he said this. He says that species appear in the fossil record looking much the same as when they disappear. Now see, that shouldn't be. If evolution is true, we would expect these species to have evolved and look very different when they finally fade off the scene, but instead over time they remain unchanged. He said, and further he says, a species does not arise gradually by the steady transformation of its ancestor. It appears all at once and fully formed. This smacks of creationism, the fossil record. It is simply not what you would expect if you really believe in this theory. You would really expect to see more transitional forms in the fossil record. Does that make sense? Any questions or thoughts on it?
I have a thought. I remember learning about the fact that, they've discovered that, like there are big leaps that happen all at once in evolution. And I'm sure the scientists have some way of explaining that, don't they? I mean, because they have to adapt their theory to
Yeah.
what they see.
Yeah,
and how
they call it, there's a term called punctuated equilibrium, and what they try and claim, theoretically, is that there were great leaps in evolution. In other words, it skipped over the transitional phases because the genetic changes were so dramatic, and so it allowed you...
Explain that. Is
Well, there is no, I mean, that's
that,
the
they don't say it's mutations at that point, they just cite
Yeah.
it's a mystery, we don't know why, but it's just suddenly
Very much
happens.
so, yeah, you do have to claim a mystery on that, and so but they theorize that's what must have happened. There's no actual evidence to really
Well, then we're
support.
getting close to what we believe, because
I
if it's a
know,
mystery, we
exactly.
think it's a mystery too.
What's ironic,
Yeah, that's why.
what's ironic about them going in that way is because Darwin himself points out it has to be very slow. I mean, I've been reading his book and it talks about slow, a lot of slow going on.
Absolutely.
So
right.
that whole fast, even the Cambrian explosion went against this thing. He realized. He
Yes.
mentioned that. That was crazy.
Yeah, right, because that was, I mean, that's been discovered for now 150 years, and more has been happening throughout time, and it just hasn't changed the story. Very, very interesting. It's very, very interesting. So, well, the third issue that I think is worth talking about is problem number 3, and it's the term that is sometimes used to describe this is irreducible complexity. Irreducible complexity. That scary term, very technical sounding, irreducible complexity refers to a system of interacting parts where the removal of one of the parts causes the system to cease functioning. And the guy who coined this term, the scientist who coined it, is Michael Behe in his book, Darwin's Black Box. Darwin's Black Box, anybody familiar with that book here? Yeah.
I've seen it hanging around the house.
You've seen it in the house, yeah. Yeah, you have.
Mark.
This was really a landmark book that Michael Behe, who is I think he's a biochemist, I think would be his term. He teaches at Lehigh University. And Michael Behe has studied this, and he wrote this book called Darwin's Black Box, where he just kind of shocked the scientific community by publishing this book. In Darwin's day, they had microscopes that could see individual cells, but the cells appeared as kind of black blobs. That was as far as the resolution in those days could take you. And so Darwin just assumed that the cell consisted of kind of just this blobbish material, and that would be easy to accidentally be formed in nature.
And that's one of the reasons why he thought that the organisms that were like, the amoebas or something were actually lower forms of life.
Exactly.
As opposed to higher forms of life.
Complex forms of life, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so, as we've gone through time, we now have these incredible microscopes that can see a lot more detail in the cell. And so Michael Behe, having studied that, and having studied biological systems, comes up with this concept. It's very interesting. The example that he uses is a mousetrap. And I have put a mousetrap on here, and for anyone who's had this problem with mice in their house or where you work, and if you have to address it, you sometimes resort to a mousetrap. And a mousetrap is a fairly simple device. It has 5 pieces, right? And those 5 pieces, the spring, the catch, the platform, the hammer, and the hold-down bar. That's all there is to a mousetrap. 5 pieces. If you remove any one of those pieces, the mousetrap does not function. It's useless. Make sense? Okay. And so what you have to have in order for that mousetrap to work are all 5 pieces together at the same time, assembled correctly, to make it functional, right? The mousetrap couldn't really have evolved by, say, 2 or 3 of the parts accidentally coming together, and then it hangs around until another part accidentally attaches itself. Couldn't happen. The 3 parts would have no reason to be together because it's not functioning, you see what I mean? Well, Michael Behe discovered that a number of systems in the human body are very much like this. They are irreducibly complex. In other words, these parts of the body are systems that they have to be there in their entirety. All the parts of the system must be there in order for that system to function, such as the human eye, or the immune system, or the blood clotting system, or in bacteria, what's called the flagellum. Now these are, again, he's a scientist, and what I love about his book, Darwin's Black Box, is that for non-scientists like me and probably most of you, he writes at a level that we can understand. But then he'll come to a section and he'll say, now if you have a scientific background, you can go on and read this section. If you don't, it's okay to skip it. And then he gives a really technical explanation of what he's talking about for the scientific community. And so then you turn like 3 or 4 pages and you get back. It's all in italics, so you see where it ends, you skip over that, and then you keep reading. So it's just really a brilliant work. And but what he shows us in this book is that inside the cell, you have, and he uses a bacteria as an example, like just a one-cell part of the bacteria. The way this cell gets around in your body is it has this tail, and it wiggles the tail, and that allows the bacteria to move in the body to a food supply or to go wherever it's being attracted to. And he's been able to actually look at the mechanism that causes this tail to move within the cell. So now in the diagram, in the upper left-hand corner of your diagram, you see that round, looks like a pill with the tails coming out. That's the bacteria. That's what it looks like in your body, okay? And what you want to do is where those tails attach to the body part, that's what we're going to zoom in on in the big picture. Okay, it's zooming in on where that tail attaches. And it turns out the way that it attaches to what looks like an outboard motor. It really has all the parts of a motor. It has a hook, there's the filament that comes off, there's a rod, there's a shaft. You don't have it all on here. But it's amazing. It's almost like technology inside that little tiny. You can imagine that the scale of this is so unbelievably small. Now, on the right is an actual photograph of what is depicted on the left. The left is a drawing, scientific drawing, but on the right is the actual photograph of where that tail or the flagellum attaches to the bacteria.
That's not real.
What's that?
That's real?
Yeah, that's an actual photograph of what's in the cell.
What is that dimension? It says its scale is 20 nm. What is that?
Nanometer.
Nanometers.
How do you relate to how?
I think a nanometer, is a billionth of an inch.
Yeah. A billionth
Of an inch. Yeah, so it'd be 20 billionths of 1 inch.
20 billionths. of
Extremely
one
small.
millimeter.
yeah, that's really
Wow.
small. And what's so amazing is that on that scale of miniature, you have this incredible complexity. I mean, it's a motor. And so the question you have to ask is how in the world nature, by accident, could create something like this? Unintelligent forces of nature, the wind, the swirling chemicals, come up with this. We just kind of intuitively know that that could not happen. We know that nature doesn't organize things. Nature tends to randomize things. The illustration in the book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, Dr. Norman Geisler uses this illustration of nature's effect on things. He says, if you took a bucket of red, white, and blue confetti and you flew it up into an airplane, say 1,000 feet high, and you dumped out that bucket of confetti, when the confetti landed, would you expect it to be in the shape of the United States flag? Probably not. Why? Because the effects of nature as it falls, the wind, for example, would randomize that confetti. And so when it landed, it would be just a random pile. It would be a random, there wouldn't be any pattern to it. And what evolutionists have to argue is that, well, you have to give it enough time. If you give it enough time, nature can organize things by accident. So Dr. Geisler says, oh, you want more time? Then take the plane from 1,000, go up to 10,000 feet, and give it more time to fall. Do you think that's going to help it? No, it'll be even more scattered, even more disorganized by the time the confetti lands. So that's kind of the concept, that nature tends to randomize things. Nature is not in the business of building machinery at a microscopic level. It just doesn't happen. This is what just amazes me about science today, folks. The more science we learn, the more unbelievable it becomes that nature could create all of this complexity at such a level. It is just absolutely stunning. And when you see the actual photograph, to me it's just like it makes the hair stand up on the back of your neck to think that that's real, and that's in every single cell. Now, understand that for the very first living cell, this had to be in place. Yeah? So it's quite amazing. Now, when you take this and you compare it to Darwin's own thinking on this, here's another quote from his book on the origin of the species. It's on page 154 from the 6th edition. Darwin wrote this: "If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous, successive, slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down." Well, guess what we found? This motor in the cell, and this is just one example, could not possibly have been formed by small, successive steps. Why? Because it's irreducibly complex. You see, all these parts have to be there in order for the bacteria to survive and to live. They all have to be there. You can't have part of that motor formed and the bacteria is still alive until more of it has generations. It doesn't survive if it can't move. The same thing with the human eye. As I go on to say, the human eye. Well, maybe the human eye developed gradually over time. Well, if you have 45% of the eye developed, it doesn't mean you have 45% vision. You have zero vision, because in order to see, all of the parts of the eye have to exist, and they have to be put together in the right way. And that's true of, as Behe demonstrates scientifically, of the blood clotting system in the immune system, in all these different systems in the human body. All the parts have to be there. Blood clotting, how important is that? You get cut without the ability to clot, what would happen? You would bleed to death anytime you got cut. People have that today. Hemophiliacs, right? Their blood does not have the ability to clot, and they have to be very, very careful. When I was growing up, there was a guy who lived across the street from me who had this, and I knew his daughter was my age, and so and this guy had to be very careful, because if he even got bruised, internally, it would just continue to bleed. I mean, that would be in big trouble. So he was very, very careful how he walked around. I smash into things all the time. I'm bumping into things, but not healthy if you're human. So if you don't have that, if you don't have that system, so in order to survive, for these ancient creatures to survive, you have to have this ability for your blood to clot, and the only way to have that is if the entire system is there and it's functioning. You can't develop it gradually over time, because the creature wouldn't survive. Same thing with eyesight. If you didn't have eyesight, the creature is not going to be around for many generations for the eye to build itself over time. It wouldn't survive. It couldn't see, so it wouldn't survive. So this concept of irreducibly complex systems is really gives us great pause when it comes to the theory of evolution. It just shows us that evolution cannot account for the way things are. It just can't. So just as I say, again, just to summarize, the crucial, irreducibly complex systems in living organisms could not have developed gradually, part by part, as evolution demands. The system would not function at all and would be useless unless it exists in its entirety. And again, having 45% of an eye doesn't mean you have 45% vision. You would have no vision. So the eye couldn't have been built successively over many generations. There would be, whatever was there wouldn't be functional, and there would be no reason for it to exist and to keep on. Any questions on that? It's a little bit technical, but I think it makes sense. Yes, Scott?
More of just a comment. I think usually you think of complexity requiring scale and size. So you think like the bigger you add more things and scale and dimension and complexity, and you think of that's the way that you build something with high complexity. Layers and size and scale and features and functions and things.
Right.
But what's amazing about this to me is some of the most absolutely complex and intricate in the tiniest of tiny space.
Yeah.
Just doesn't make sense.
No.
Complexity goes the other way. So this challenges anyone, right, who thinks about physical evolution and adding complexity and scale and size over time. Just really stop and question your thought process.
It really does.
Yes, to get to the tiniest of tiny, the smallest of small. Yet inside of that is complexity beyond imagination.
Yeah.
How can that happen?
How could intelligent scientists do that today?
Yeah.
Even with all their wherewithal. And you're saying that nature did this? Unintelligent forces of nature accidentally came up with this? When brilliant scientists can't even duplicate it? Like I said, just intuitively, we know that just doesn't make sense.
Right.
Yeah.
It boggles my mind when I see how the eye works.
Mm.
We don't think about it, we use it until it starts to fail, and then we
Yeah, right.
get a pair of glasses. And
Thankfully.
Yeah, but really, if you look deep, how it functions,
It's just miraculous, really. And to try and attribute that to the unintelligent causes of nature just doesn't make sense. It just doesn't. Yeah.
Isn't it funny that 9/11, that chaos that happened at the trade centers, right? Everything collapsed.
Mm.
The only thing that was formed was a cross.
Oh, right.
That's all that was left.
Yeah.
I mean, that should say something.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Really true. Laura, did you have something?
Can you just tell me a little more about Darwin's quote there, and where he stood based on that, what he said?
He did not know about this in his day.
Oh, right, because.
Science just hadn't
Microscope
developed to the
penetrates
point,
that far.
yeah, where they knew this kind of stuff.
So
Like I
Darwin-
said, when you look at a cell, all he could see was a black blob.
Okay,
Now, when we look at the cell, we see what's in the drawing.
so he would have admitted that.
If he could have, I
Against
think,
his
right.
theory,
Well,
but-
it's hard to say, but it would seem that if he knew then what we know now, he might have had a lot of second thoughts about his theory.
He would have been still calling it a theory.
Yeah, hard to say what he would have said, but yeah. Well, the final problem is one that I think is also interesting. It's almost more of a philosophical thing, but it relates to physics, and that's what you would call the law of entropy. Scientists refer to it as the second law of thermodynamics. We did touch on this when we talked about the cosmological argument, but just to remind us of what it is. Natural processes always result in the loss of usable energy and an increase in what's called entropy or disorder. Okay? All systems left to themselves will eventually decay and degenerate, moving from order to disorder. This is something that is observable today, and it's actually so consistent that science has made it into a law. It's actually one of the laws of science that this is simply what happens to every living system. It ultimately decays and degenerates and turns into something that doesn't work. It becomes disorderly. Our bodies, when you die, what happens? First of all, they begin aging, right? And then when you die, it degenerates, it decomposes, it decays, and in the end, it's nothing. That's kind of how nature works. Nature takes us in that direction. Everything runs in the direction from complexity to decay when left to itself. But the theory of evolution contradicts this law by describing a world where things run from disorder to extreme complexity. So in other words, the theory of evolution kind of runs counter to everything we are able to observe in nature. Evolution says things have gone from a state of disorder and accidentally have assembled themselves into a more orderly, more complex systems. And as we've seen today, almost unbelievably complex, miniature, and a huge, the whole thing, all these systems.
How would they explain that contradiction? I mean, they themselves believe.
Again, the scientific community doesn't really criticize itself. But as I say, there's a growing number of scientists now who are coming out and saying, we need to be honest. We need to look at the evidence and follow where it leads. And they're being, they try to be hushed, and it's it's really sad. As I was mentioning, there's a biochemist by the name of Douglas Axe. He's with the intelligent design movement. And I was at a conference and he was speaking, and he was saying how in the beginning of his research he would publish, he'd do his research, he does work on proteins and very, very, amino acids within the proteins. And then he says that he would publish his work and it'd be published in peer, reviewed scientific journals until they found out kind of what he was concluding from all this, that all of this work on proteins was suggesting that nature could not have done this on its own, and all of a sudden, everything is rejected that he submits. That's just what the reality is. And so, in order to get his work published, he had to actually start his own journal, his own scientific journal, which they did, thankfully. And so his work can now be published. But that's just kind of the attitude that exists that we're up against. Evolutionists claim that atoms self-organize into amino acids turn into amoebas turn into fish turn into apes, and apes turn into scientists. That is the theory. That's the theory. But what we're seeing is that it's not actually turning out. And entropy also applies to DNA mutations. And I have this quote. It's from Hank Hanegraaff in his book, The Face That Demonstrates the Farce of Evolution. And he writes this: contemporary information theory tells us that, quote, random processes do not produce information, but rather distort information. Thus, random deviations in genetic material will not increase genetic information, which would be necessary for evolution to progress, let alone produce DNA in the first place. So it just doesn't make sense I think when you look at the evidence, it doesn't lead us to conclude that, hey, the theory of evolution must be correct. Rather, I think just the opposite. And I would really just encourage you, the intelligent design movement, sometimes referred to as the ID movement, I think there's just a number of brilliant scientists on there. I wish I could remember their names offhand. There's one guy who's very famous in the scientific community back in the 1960s, wrote kind of the book on evolution that high schools use. Like nationally, high schools were using in the 1960s and into the 1970s. But then he, after looking at the evidence, he realizes that his book was just completely wrong. And the conclusions that he drew were wrong and not based on the evidence. And so he kind of recanted the whole thing, but they still continued to use his book. Not for like over a decade. The book just didn't go anywhere. It stayed out there in circulation. And so, but he's now a part of the intelligent design movement that says, you know what, the evidence just doesn't point to the theory of evolution being true. So what do we conclude from all this? The God of the Bible is the perfect explanation for life in all of its forms. There is a conclusion that we can draw from the evidence. I think a more reasonable conclusion than Darwin's theory of evolution, and that is simply that God exists, and He's the one who is responsible for the little motors in the bacteria, and for the cell's complexity, and for all these systems that are irreducibly complex. God is the one who designed it and built it. Insurmountable problems associated with the theory of evolution exist in the fields of biochemistry, physics, genetics, anthropology, and paleontology. Paleontology is the study of fossils. Evolutionists must have great faith in the theory of evolution, given the science. It takes a lot of faith to believe in this theory, I think. I think it takes less faith to believe that the biblical account of creation is actually true. When God created, He created the species according to their own kind. We would expect that if that's true, we would see them in the fossil record appear suddenly, fully formed. That's exactly what we see. So this idea of science and religion conflicting, I think, is a myth. And I think the more science that's revealed, the more and more we can feel comfortable as Christians believing that if God has created all this, then His fingerprints are all over His creation. And I think that is exactly what we're beginning to find with science. His fingerprints, His handiwork. So don't worry if you feel like you watch a special on the History Channel or whatever, or the Discovery Channel, and talks about the theory of evolution being true, or assuming that it's true. According to the theory of evolution, this should have happened. Every time I see it, I just roll my eyes and I go, what else is on? So that's, sometimes I watch it just to see what they're saying. But any questions or thoughts?
Just a comment, I was reading in Proverbs yesterday about God giving you the ability to understand complex things by first fearing the Lord.
Mm.
And in order to fear the Lord, you have to acknowledge His existence.
Mm-hmm.
And once you've made that step, then God will allow you to understand through intelligence and knowledge and wisdom and insight very complex matters.
Yeah.
We first were in the first session, you were talking about sort of like walking into a courtroom. There's certain facts and evidence investigation that you need to bring in order to prove your points and prove your case.
Mm.
Yet we have 12 jurors sitting on a panel who shouldn't really understand those level of complex issues.
Mm-hmm.
But I truly believe that in this matter here, if you first establish that God exists, and then you seek God's will in your life, and you ask God to give you the wisdom, insight, intelligence, and knowledge, that these matters become available to all of us to understand, to appreciate, and to believe, and then to lead us forward.
Yeah. Well said. Yes.
I want also to encourage you to pray. We pray morning, noon, and night for our young people that are going to college
Yeah.
because they are very influential. And our kids, if they are not well prepared, then they are, sent
Yeah.
astray. And it is hard. It is hard even for adults, right?
Yeah.
To
Well, you
even
know-
less if they are not prepared for that kind of.
I'm glad you mentioned this because I was talking the other day. There's studies that have come out that are showing that among high school students who have been in church, those students who go to secular colleges and universities, approximately 75% walk away from the faith during their time in college, and by the time they graduate are no longer Christians. 75%, 3 out of 4 attending secular colleges and universities. That's a really frightening thought, and that's a call for us to prepare them while they're in high school with information like this so that they're not so easily swayed when they get in a classroom and a professor who is smart and sounds smart begins telling them that the Bible's just full of myth and legend and that's religion, this is science. We got to prepare our children better, and that's a really good point.
And I would like to add, we shouldn't think that because our kids are going to a Christian school, they are, they're going to become, because it should be, but sadly it's not that way. So we should be also living at home.
Exactly.
That's key. If you don't live it at home, don't expect the kids.
Yeah.
I'll give it to the Christian school that they can fix it.
No, parents have to
That's
take on that
usually
responsibility.
happens.
It's very, very
So, but
important.
it should be in the
Yeah,
house.
it's a great point.
If you don't have kids, pray for the
Pray for the ones who do.
Pray, yes, for the friends that you have, if you have nieces and nephews, pray for them,
Yeah.
be a good example to them.
Very good, very good. All right, we are getting late.
Go ahead.
Did you have one more quick?
No,
Quick-
I was just adding to that.
Okay,
That's
all
all.
right. All right, let me pray and then we'll go in. Lord, thank you for your word that is true. You have revealed to us who you are and what you've done, and I thank you, Lord, that as even the world of science progresses and develops, more and more we see evidence that points to you. That only makes sense. You have created all of this, and it is your handiwork, Lord. And it truly points to you when we follow the evidence where it leads. And I just pray that all of us would take this into our hearts and that it would help us in our own faith, confirming what we believe to be true. We thank you, Lord, in Jesus' name. Amen. Oh, by the way, you can turn that off. It's not done.